What if I told you London's greatest social crisis wasn't caused by crime, but by policy? In the 1700s, Parliament encouraged a drink to weaken foreign rivals and boost the economy. The result? Gin so cheap the poorest citizens could buy it by the cup. At first, it felt like progress, then it felt like escape, then it felt necessary. Within a generation, the capital of an empire was staggering under a habit it had legally engineered itself, and shutting it down would prove even more dangerous than starting it. Before we uncover what history tried to hide, subscribe to Unseen Evidence, because some truths were never meant to be found. And tell me where you're watching this from. I'm curious to know. Let's continue. The city never notices the exact moment when comfort becomes dependence, when habit becomes culture, and when culture becomes a force powerful enough to reshape daily life. And London in the early 18th century was a city moving faster than its own. Understanding, swelling with new arrivals, restless ambition, and the promise that opportunity could be found in every alley and market stall if one simply worked hard enough or endured long enough. Yet beneath the noise of progress, something quieter unfolded, not announced by thunder or proclamation, but by the steady rhythm of small glasses lifted in dim rooms, where exhaustion met relief, and relief slowly transformed into routine. Because gin arrived not as a villain, but as a solution, a practical answer to surplus grain, economic rivalry, and the constant need for warmth in a damp and unforgiving climate. And at first, no one believed that anything so simple could hold the power to change the course of a city. Yet change does not require permission and rarely waits for recognition. And so the drink spread through London like a rumor carried by wind, passed from neighbor to neighbor, embraced by laborers whose days were long and uncertain, by merchants seeking quick profit, by officials convinced that domestic production meant strength against foreign competitors. And the early years felt almost festive as distilleries multiplied, as signs promising comfort appeared in windows, as conversations grew louder and laughter lingered longer into the night, and observers wrote about the strange new energy flowing through the streets, a blend of hope and destruction that made the city feel alive in unfamiliar ways. Yet beneath that vitality lay something fragile, because abundance changes behavior, and when something becomes too accessible, its meaning shifts, and gin moved from novelty to necessity faster than anyone expected, slipping into morning routines, into midday pauses, into evenings meant for rest. And as more people turned toward it, the city's rhythms began to bend. Subtly at first, as employers noticed small disruptions, as families adjusted to changing moods, as markets adapted to new patterns of demand. And still the drink flowed because economic incentives outweighed hesitation, and lawmakers, eager to encourage local industry, created policies that allowed production to flourish with minimal oversight, believing they were strengthening the nation rather than opening a door that would prove difficult to close. And for a time it seemed they were correct, as revenue increased and trade expanded, as entrepreneurs found opportunity in distillation, bottle making, and distribution, as entire neighborhoods discovered new sources of income. Yet prosperity built on a single trend carries risk, especially when that trend touches the human need for escape, because the pressures of urban life were relentless, with overcrowded housing, unstable employment, and social hierarchies that left many feeling invisible. And gin offered something immediate and uncomplicated, a brief quieting of worries that required no explanation, and this accessibility made it different from older traditions tied to ceremony or wealth, transforming drinking from an occasional event into a constant background presence. And as the years passed, critics began to speak more loudly, not always out of moral superiority, but out of genuine concern that the city's balance was shifting too far in one direction. Yet their warnings faced resistance from those who saw regulation as interference or hypocrisy, because the same authorities who now questioned gin had once encouraged it, and debate spread through pamphlets, sermons, and public gatherings where voices rose and fell like waves, each side convinced it understood the true nature of the problem. And meanwhile, ordinary citizens continued navigating daily life, adapting in ways rarely captured by official narratives, creating informal systems of support and survival that allowed communities to function even as public discourse grew increasingly dramatic, and artists contributed to the atmosphere by producing exaggerated depictions that blurred the line between satire and documentation, shaping perceptions among those who had never walked through the neighborhoods being portrayed. And these images influenced policy as much as statistics did, reminding us that storytelling has always shaped history as powerfully as law, and lawmakers responded with new regulations designed to curb consumption by raising prices and restricting licenses, believing that inconvenience would reduce reliance. Yet unintended consequences followed quickly, as underground cellars emerged, as coded signals guided customers to hidden rooms, as enforcement struggled against the sheer scale of demand, and the city entered a phase where official reality and lived experience diverged, creating an environment of uncertainty that made the crisis feel both exaggerated and undeniable at the same time. And in the midst of this tension, alternative social spaces began gaining popularity. Coffee houses where conversation replaced intoxication, tea rooms where refinement symbolized stability, suggesting that cultural shifts rarely occur through prohibition alone, but through the introduction of new identities people wished to adopt. And as tea grew fashionable, it subtly reframed public expectations around daily rituals, offering a slower, more deliberate form of comfort that contrasted with gin's immediacy. Yet change moved gradually because habits rooted in survival resist easy transformation, and for many the drink remained a reliable companion through difficult times, illustrating that societal challenges rarely arise from a single cause but from the intersection of economic policy, social pressure, and human psychology. And historians later would describe this era as a mirror reflecting the anxieties of rapid urbanization, revealing how quickly communities must adapt when technological or economic shifts outpace cultural understanding, and London itself became both laboratory and lesson, demonstrating how attempts to control behavior often reshape it rather than eliminate it. And as enforcement campaigns intensified, they sometimes generated sympathy for those targeted, reinforcing divisions between authority and citizenry, and protests erupted not only because people wanted to drink, but because they resisted what felt like inconsistent governance. And over time, policymakers adjusted their approach, combining regulation with broader social initiatives aimed at addressing underlying conditions rather than symptoms alone, supporting charitable organizations, promoting employment stability, and encouraging cultural alternatives that gradually reduced reliance without demanding immediate abandonment. And this multifaceted strategy began altering the city's tone, with fewer overt signs of excess and more emphasis on balance, and distillers themselves evolved, improving quality and branding to appeal to a changing market that now valued sophistication over sheer potency, transforming gin's identity from rough necessity into something refined and controlled. And ironically, the drink that once symbolized chaos became associated with elegance in certain circles, demonstrating how cultural meaning shifts alongside regulation and perception. And as the crisis slowly eased, its memory solidified into legend, shaped by moralists, artists, and politicians who each framed the story according to their priorities, leaving future generations with a narrative that felt clear despite the messy reality that had unfolded. And yet beneath those simplified accounts lay the deeper truth that London had not nearly collapsed because of a drink alone, but because of the conditions that made that drink irresistible, reminding us that history's most compelling stories are rarely about objects or substances, but about the human search for relief, belonging, and agency in environments that feel overwhelming. And walking through the city decades later, one could still sense echoes of that period in the architecture of old distilleries repurposed into meeting halls, in the language of proverbs warning against excess, in the quiet rituals of tea shared between friends as a symbol of moderation, learned through experience. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of the gin crisis is not that London almost lost itself, but that it discovered, through trial and error, how fragile stability can be when innovation outpaces reflection, because every era believes itself immune to repeating past mistakes, until new forms of abundance emerge promising easy answers to complicated problems. And so the story continues not as a closed chapter, but as a reminder that cities, like people, are constantly negotiating between comfort and caution, freedom and responsibility, escape and endurance. And if one listens carefully to the imagined footsteps along those old streets, one might hear the whispers of a society learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to live with its own inventions without being consumed by them. And that lesson remains unfinished, carried forward each time a culture embraces something new without fully understanding how deeply it may change the rhythm of everyday life.